On May 28th, a three-judge panel of the U.S. Court of International Trade dealt a stinging rebuke to President Trump's new trade regime. The court blocked President Donald Trump from imposing sweeping tariffs on nearly all imports, ruling that the 1977 International Emergency Economic Powers Act IEEPA does not authorize the president to unilaterally impose whatever tariff rates he deems desirable. In other words, the judges found that Mr. Trump had exceeded his authority, invading Congress's turf over taxes and trade. This bombshell ruling has immediate teeth. Most of the new tariffs are now enjoined, at least temporarily, unless and until higher courts say otherwise. The controversy traces to April 2, 2025, when the White House stunned allies by unveiling an unprecedented global tariff regime. President Trump used a flashy Rose Garden press event to announce 10% baseline tariffs on most imports, plus steep reciprocal surtaxes up to 50% on dozens of countries with which the U.S. runs big trade deficits. He framed this as an emergency response to the decades of U.S. trade deficits and other threats, invoking the 1977 IEEPA 2 Act without Congress. Earlier in 2025, he had even imposed tariffs on Chinese, Mexican, and Canadian goods, claiming a national emergency over drug trafficking and illegal immigration. Trump justified these sweeping taxes under IEEPA and a declared national emergency over trade deficits. Almost immediately, challengers went to court. By late April, a coalition of a dozen Democratic-led states, New York, California, Oregon, Illinois, etc., and a group of small import businesses sued in the U.S. Court of International Trade, arguing the tariffs were illegal because Congress never authorized them. They claimed that IEEPA, which was designed for genuine crises, cannot be stretched into a blank check for broad trade taxes. As one California business owner put it, these unilateral tariffs created immediate and irreparable harm to families, farmers, and manufacturers. In short, critics warned that forcing consumers and small businesses to pay war taxes on everyday goods was a recipe for chaos and inflation. Well, what does IEEPA say? IEEPA grants the president emergency powers to regulate international transactions when a national emergency threatens the U.S. economy, security, or foreign policy, but Congress framed IEEPA narrowly. It only applies to any unusual and extraordinary threat declared as a national emergency, and even then the president may only deal with that threat. In other words, IEEPA is a crisis tool, not a general trade authority. The court's opinion zeroed in on two key limits in IEEPA. First, the statutory power to regulate importation. Language lifted from an older emergency law was never meant to be read as a blank check to set unlimited tariffs. Second, any use of IEEPA must be tied to an unusual and extraordinary threat that the president has formally declared a national emergency to confront. In this case, the court noted, the claimed crisis, long-term trade deficits or cross-border crime, was not an emergency created by some sudden catastrophe. Trade deficits, the judges pointed out, hardly amount to a sudden emergency after nearly 50 years. In practical terms, the court said, the worldwide tariffs had no statutory limit on amount or duration. In IEEPA language, the worldwide and retaliatory tariff orders lack any identifiable limits and thus fall outside the scope of what Congress allowed. Likewise, the specialized fentanyl and cartel-related tariffs were tossed out because they simply did not meet IEEPA's condition of dealing with a true foreign threat. For example, slapping 15% tariffs on Mexican auto parts to stop cartels was seen as causing economic pain, not directly solving that particular crisis. The court's ruling was emphatic. It held that Congress, not the president alone, has the power to set tariffs under the Constitution. The worldwide and retaliatory tariff orders exceed any authority granted to the president by IEEPA, the judges wrote, calling Trump's scheme ultra-vires and contrary to law. In plain terms, they struck down virtually all of the new tariffs. The judges also reminded everyone that even in an emergency, IEEPA can only be used for the very threat announced. which the current tariffs failed to deal with in any meaningful way. As an Associated Press summary put it, the court found Trump had overstepped his authority when he invoked IEEPA to declare a national emergency and impose these taxes. Indeed, the court concluded that Trump's foreign trade deficits simply were not an unusual and extraordinary threat warranting such radical measures. Notably, Judge Katzmann, a Trump appointee, and his colleagues cited historical cases to avoid any constitutionally suspect delegation of unlimited power. The upshot: most of Trump's new tariffs are illegal until, or unless, Congress explicitly reauthorizes them, which is capturing how ordinary Americans felt caught in trade war crossfire. By day's end, U.S. and Asian stocks were up on news of the court's ruling. The ruling immediately became a political hot potato. The White House's first response was defiant. A senior aide declared it is not for unelected judges to decide how to properly address a national emergency. White House counsel filed notice of appeal the same day. Top Trump advisors labeled the judge as activist for blocking his policy. Officials warned that rescinding the tariffs could trigger a foreign policy disaster and pledged to deploy every lever of executive power to keep America tough in trade. By contrast, Democratic officials cheered. New York's Attorney General, one of the lead plaintiffs, declared the law is clear. No president has the power to single-handedly raise taxes whenever they like. California Governor Gavin Newsom was blunt. These tariffs are illegal, full stop, he said, praising the court for agreeing that Trump had overstepped his authority and harmed American families and businesses. The ruling was widely framed as a victory for the rule of law and congressional power. Even Wall Street breathed a sigh of relief. U.S. and Asian markets ticked higher after the decision, reflecting hopes that trade tensions might ease. The case has immediate effects on policy. The court gave the administration 10 days to suspend collection of the struck-down tariffs, and some had already been paused. President Trump's team asked the court to stay the order during appeal, arguing that lifting the tariffs now would hurt fragile trade talks. Meanwhile, pundits note that even if the case goes to the Supreme Court, a defeat there wouldn't automatically reinstate the tariffs. Congress would still need to act in one way or another. For middle and working class Americans, this legal drama offers a reprieve. The court highlighted dozens of anecdotes where U.S. companies and workers were already hurt. For instance, a Virginia educational toy maker warned it might be unable to pay its employees or even go under if the tariffs stayed in place, and a New York importer of bicycle parts reported paying $25,000 extra in duties, money he could no longer afford. The judges noted that the government didn't even deny these stories were true. The government does not meaningfully contest the economic logic that these retaliatory tariffs harmed ordinary businesses. That line in the ruling, echoing Prussian economic philosopher Frederick Bastiat, drove home that when it comes to trade wars, it's Americans on Main Street who pay. Trading partners and global markets watched closely. On the whole, Allied governments quietly welcomed the news, seeing it as a return to normalcy. Notably, U.S. allies like the EU and Japan had already been reluctant to strike hard deals during the 90-day tariff pause, fearing they might be trumped by more tariff threats. As one British official put it, partners had been holding back on concessions once Washington blinked under market pressure. Now, with a court-ordered pause, foreign leaders can proceed cautiously. The EU, for example, managed to squeeze an extension of trade talks out of Trump back in April after threatening 50% levies. The tariff rollback sends the message that Washington's extreme tactics are negotiable, which could encourage other countries to hold out for better terms. Global financial markets responded positively in early trading after the ruling. Asian and U.S. stock indices rose and European markets were largely flat, economists suggested. Relief was driven by the prospect of lower consumer prices. American households pay higher prices under tariffs and diminished risk of a broader trade war. U.S. businesses that had complained loudly from car factories to farm exporters can breathe a bit easier. On the other hand, some emerging market traders are now suspicious. If the U.S. retreats from one corner of trade hawkishness, might it double down on other pressures? The situation remains fluid. What happens next is still up in the air. The Trump administration has already appealed to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit and is expected to carry the case eventually to the Supreme Court. Legal experts say the challenge will be hard-fought. One appellate lawyer notes that when a case like this, framed as the largest tax increase in American history, reaches conservative justices, they may well emphasize Congress's exclusive power over commerce and taxation. Many predict that, barring a quick legislative fix, the courts will ultimately uphold the limits on executive tariff power. Meanwhile, the administration is already eyeing Plan Bs. Experts have pointed out that other statutes still allow Trump to raise some duties. The court itself noted the Trade Act of 1974 gives a 15% tariff power for 150 days on deficit countries. Analysts at Goldman Sachs estimate the White House could immediately replace the 10% global tariffs with a 15% 450-day version under that law. Trump could also revert to Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act, national security, or Section 301 unfair trade tools he used in his first term, though those require investigations and comment periods. There is even talk of dusting off a little-used 1930 tariff law to hit back against discriminating trading partners. In short, analysts expect new skirmishes. This is just one more bump in the tariff road that we are going to be on for as long as Trump remains in office, warned trade expert Deborah Elms. Indeed, the court's decision may prompt the administration to pivot toward industry-specific tariffs, steel, autos, etc., or new legislation, or to press Congress to retroactively authorize the tariffs. But convincing Congress to vote on something this controversial seems unlikely and, as the BBC noted, would become a delicate tug-of-war of industry lobbying on Capitol Hill. For U.S. consumers and businesses, the likely short-term outcome is more uncertainty. Tariff collection on many goods is halted, lowering prices and easing some supply chain headaches for now. But the legal fight continues. And until either Congress or the courts provides a final answer, importers can't be sure whether they'll eventually have to repay or pay new duties. In the longer term, this case could reshape how presidents use emergency powers for economic policy and whether Americans expect trade policy to be written by Congress or at the president's whim. This episode underscores a classic tension in American democracy: who decides trade policy? The Constitution clearly gives Congress the power to regulate commerce, and the courts have reminded us that even the president must operate within those constitutional lines. For middle-income Americans, the big takeaway is that sweeping tariff taxes, which inevitably raise consumer prices, cannot be imposed without clear legal backing. In the words of one jurist, there has to be a very big doubt about letting the president waive such a blank check. Whether you agreed with Trump's policies or not, it's worth pondering. Should a major economic policy like this be made by presidential fiat, or should Congress debate it openly? It is also a reminder of the real stakes. Everyday families and workers pay the price in higher store prices and supply shocks. The court heard painful stories of small companies cut to the bone by these tariffs. As commentators on all sides have noted, this is ultimately a debate over who bears that burden. Now that the judicial branch has stepped in, the political branches will have to pick up the pieces. Will Congress draft a new law on trade deficits? Will the White House pursue tariffs through narrower statutes? Or will America attempt to strengthen its global trading relationships in other ways? One thing is certain, this ruling has thrown the Trump trade agenda into uncertainty and sparked lively debate. Middle and lower income Americans who've struggled under past tariff hikes will be watching closely. After all, with grocery bills already too high and paychecks too tight. Make America Great Again might mean something very different when it comes off the press release and hits the supermarket shelf.
That's it for today. Thank you for watching.